At the beginning of May, Spirit Airlines, with about 114 aircraft and roughly 17,000 employees, stopped flying. And within days, one of the most familiar, ultra-low-cost carriers in America had shifted from trying to restructure their airline to liquidating it. By now, you've probably read some version of how it all happened. Or, at the very least, heard headlines like, customers had finally tired of paying for every back and seat and other add-ons, or that the fee model had finally collapsed under its own weight. But those are the headlines. Yes, the customer side of this case isn't false. The fee experience indeed had become a real source of customer frustration. But the customer experience story isn't central here. The reason that actually drove Spirit downfall, when you trace it back through the bankruptcy filings and the reporting from last weeks of April, had almost nothing to do with passengers at all. The key to the story was essentially a decision about the capital structure of the company. A decision that was made by a relatively small group of senior creditors, and the math they did when a federal rescue package landed on the table. Today we are going to figure out what actually happened with Spirit Airlines. 3 things in the story are worth slowing down on. The first is how Spirit actually made money, because cheap seats and lots of fees is the service answer, not the operating one. And once you see how the model was actually built, almost everything that follows starts to click. The second is what made that model fragile from the inside, and how the shocks of the last few years gradually drained the airline of every reserve it had, well before fuel ever spiked. And the third is what happened in the final few weeks, when the roughly $500 million federal rescue ran into the people who already had priority claims on Spirit. Let's start with how Spirit actually made money. But before that, welcome back to AppliedStuff. My name is Lilia, and this is the place where ideas meet practical application. My goal is simple, to help you think deeper and act smarter. And if you get value from this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel. It really means a lot to me. So, Spirit. Spirit was what's called an ultra-low-cost carrier. And in my opinion, this label is a little misleading. Because what Spirit was really selling wasn't a cheap flight at all. What Spirit was selling was a base fare, usually a low one, sometimes exceptionally low. The kind of number that would catch your eye and make you think you would found a bargain. But hold on, because later on you will be charged separately every other piece that is missing. The carry-on bag? Sold to you. The seat assignment? Sold to you. The bottle of water on board? Sold to you. And I could go on and on. The technical name for this approach is unbundling. Let me simplify and give you an example. Imagine you're on a Spirit booking page. In a good week, the math worked out something like this. You would see a fare to Las Vegas at $39, you would click it, and by the time you would edit the bag, pick the seat next to your traveling companion, and bought something to drink, you were already closer to 90. So the fare wasn't really the price. The fare was the bait. And this matters, because the math for a long time actually worked. In 2023, which would turn out to be Spirit's last year before the second bankruptcy began, more than half of Spirit's operating revenue came from those add-ons rather than from the ticket itself. On a per-passenger basis, the ancillary charges brought in more than the fare. Which is to say, by the early 2020s, Spirit was primarily in the business of selling you the bag and the seat. The flight underneath was the smaller piece of the transaction. But that's the revenue side. Now, let us focus on the operations. Let us start with the cabin. Spirit packed more seats into every airplane than a legacy carrier did. About 28 inches of space between rows, whereas Delta or American would typically give you something closer to 30 or 31. And the reason that matters isn't simple arithmetic. More seats per plane means a lower cost per seat. Of course, only if those seats are actually being filled on every flight. In other words, Spirit needed high load factors for the model to work. And in good years, everything held together. But by 2025, with utilization falling and cost pressure in the business, the break-even math started playing against Spirit. Then the airline itself. Spirit didn't run a hub-and-spoke network the way Delta or American Airlines do, meaning passengers were not being routed through a central airport on their way somewhere else. They mostly flew Spirit direct, point to point, between cities where the airline had decided the route made commercial sense. And the fleet, to my knowledge, was a single aircraft family, the Airbus A320, which meant mechanics, pilots, training pipelines, and spare parts could all be standardized around one type of plane and one set of systems. The airline outsourced what it could, and it sold most of its tickets directly to the customers, without paying a commission to any travel agency. And it built its schedules around keeping aircraft in the air as many hours per day as it could, with as little dead time on the ground as possible. Every operating choice the company made was, in one way or another at its core, a choice about pushing unit cost down. Look at all of those choices as a whole, and you will notice something. Every single decision of Spirit, whether the denser cabins, the higher utilization, or the single fleet type, is essentially the same thing. Spirit Airlines is basically trying to push each variable as far toward less as it can, while maneuvering to sustain proper operations. The whole operating identity of Spirit as a business was built around driving unit cost low enough that the legacy carriers couldn't credibly compete in the same fare bands. And I must admit that when all of those variables happen to be working at the same time, when fuel is cheap, when the planes are flying, when customers are tolerating the seats, and when the legacy carriers haven't yet decided to fight you in your fare band, this model is genuinely powerful because it undercuts everyone and it scales. But here's the thing though, each optimization is also a risk. What lets you compete on price in good times is the same thing that makes you fragile when conditions move. And let me tell you something, conditions eventually always move. Now, let me run through that same list of design choices, but inverted. An idea is to take each one and trace what it costs you if something goes wrong. Look, when the margin per seat is thin, a small rise in your cost translates into a much bigger loss in your profit. The thing is, when the model depends on very high load factors, even a modest drop in demand can drop the airline below the line for the entire quarter. So, when utilization is the lever you've been pulling the hardest, there is just no free gap in your schedule, even for a maintenance. And add to that Spirit running the entire fleet on a single aircraft family, which in normal times gives you all of the savings of standardization. That same standardization concentrates higher risk. And if something goes wrong with the engines that power that family, the whole airline gets affected all at once. We're going to come back to this point again later on, because it becomes central in 2023. That said, let us take a look at the customer perspective. A business that has selected year after year for the most price sensitive traveler in the market. Yeah, that person who comes to the booking page, sorts everything by base fare, and clicks whichever flight is cheapest, has done something subtly paradoxical to itself. It has acquired an enormous customer base on the one hand, but a customer base that is almost by definition ready to switch to a different airline the moment its fares move up. Which means that when costs rise, you can't pass those costs through. You don't have the pricing power defense that Delta or American Airlines has, because you spend years training your customer to pretty much optimize against you. And yeah, the fee fatigue conversation that's been circulating in airline coverage for years isn't wrong exactly. It's just smaller than the headlines made it sound. Fee fatigue didn't kill Spirit. What fee fatigue meant in practical operating terms was that Spirit couldn't raise its base fare to absorb a fuel shock, or a labor shock, or any other shock, because the customer it had spent all those years pursuing just wouldn't tolerate it. Having said that, the discount driven traveler is a customer you can't price up to. So when costs went up, Spirit had nowhere to compensate. Now, let's go through the timeline of what actually broke, because what happened to Spirit only really makes sense if you watch the shock's land and sequence. In 2022, Spirit and Frontier had agreed to merge. By July, the deal had been terminated, and Spirit pivoted almost immediately toward a much bigger one, JetBlue's roughly $3.8 billion agreement. JetBlue was Spirit's actual escape route. It was the deal that, if it had closed, would have reshaped Spirit's competitive position permanently and changed what kind of business it had to be. However, in January 2024, a federal judge blocked it on antitrust grounds, and by March of that year, the deal was officially dead. With it died the last realistic path Spirit had to scale that didn't involve a bankruptcy court. In July 2023, and this is what I told you we would come back to, RTX, the parent company of Pratt Whitney, disclosed a manufacturing defect in its geared turbofan engines, specifically the engines that power the Airbus A320neo family, which Spirit operated. The defect required pulling aircraft out of service for accelerated inspections, and some of Spirit's A320neos ended up grounded for months at a time. And by 2025, the average Spirit plane was flying about 8 hours a day, down from around 11 just 2 years earlier. Those 3 hours a day, every plane, every day, do not come back. For a network carrier with a diversified fleet, that kind of utilization drop is a serious problem. But for an ultra low-cost carrier whose entire break-even math depends on flying every plane as many hours as possible, as you may understand, it's simply devastating. And so, by November 2024, Spirit had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy for the first time. It emerged the following March in 2025 with a fresh restructuring plan. 5 months after that, it was back in bankruptcy. And then in March of 2026, with the strikes on Iran already underway and fuel markets already moving, the company and its bondholders negotiated a new agreement that would have allowed Spirit to emerge again, this time as a smaller, going concern. The plan that was signed assumed jet fuel would average somewhere around $2.24 per gallon over 2026. It was, in effect, a bet that prices would come back down. They didn't. Jet fuel went from the planning assumption of $2.24 to roughly $4.51 a gallon by late April. The plan that had taken months to negotiate was overtaken in a week. The hole in Spirit's liquidity, the gap between the cash it had on hand and the cash it now needed, opened up to hundreds of millions of dollars. And there was just no way for the company to close it on its own. But here's the thing I want to be careful about, because this is where most of the coverage gets it wrong. The shocks didn't all land at the same time. They landed in sequence and over years. The takeaway isn't Spirit got hit by three things at once. The takeaway is more curious than that. Every shock a business absorbs reduces non-linearly its capacity to absorb the next one. Spirit had spent its merger optionality. It has lost fleet flexibility when the engines went bad. It had used bankruptcy once and was already inside its second one. By the time the fuel spike landed in April, there was almost nothing left in reserve. So the spike didn't kill a healthy airline. It killed an airline that had already burned through its options, one shock at a time. And late in this process, the federal government floated a roughly $500 million financing package. Money that would have allowed Spirit to keep operating through the bankruptcy and emerge on the other side. According to the public reporting, the proposal included warrants, which is to say, the right for the government to take an equity stake of up to roughly 90% if the airline did emerge. You would think at that point that the question on the table was whether Spirit's leadership wanted to accept that deal, but it wasn't. By that point, Spirit's leadership didn't have very much practical leverage. The actual question was whether existing bondholders and key financial stakeholders would support the rescue that changed their priority in the capital structure. Reuters reported that some of the Spirit's largest creditors, including Citadel, opposed the rescue, while Spirit itself named Citadel, Cyrus Capital, and Avers Management among the financial stakeholders involved in restructuring efforts. So let me slow down for a moment on what priority actually means here, because this is the part of the story that almost nobody explains in plain English, but it's where the whole thing becomes interesting. If to simplify, when a company gets into trouble, every creditor sits somewhere in what's called the capital stack, which is essentially a queue for getting paid back if things break. At the front of the queue are the senior secured lenders, the people who lend money against specific collateral and have first claim on it. Behind them are the junior creditors, and at the very back, on the day the company finally has to liquidate, are the equity holders, the shareholders. If the company restructures or sells assets, the people at the front of the queue get paid first. That's the entire reason senior debt is cheaper for a company to issue than equity in the first place. In other words, a senior lender accepts a lower yield in exchange for being first in line if and when things go wrong. Now, what does federal financing have to do with all that? The key here is that the proposed federal financing would have changed the order of the queue. New money would have moved to the front ahead of the existing bondholders. And there is a technical name for that, priming. But the everyday version is simpler. The old creditors get pushed back. Their priority, the thing they have paid for by accepting a lower yield in the first place, becomes worth less. So the question those bondholders were really facing wasn't, do we want to save Spirit? It was, do we agree to be pushed back or do we block the deal and let the bankruptcy process move forward toward asset sales and lease returns? That's where the math comes in. The company still had valuable assets, aircraft, engines, spare parts, and operating rights. According to Reuters, Spirit had already lined up a process to sell 20 aircraft for more than $500 million. So, for some creditors, liquidation may have looked financially better than accepting a rescue that pushed them backward in the repayment queue. In other words, the bondholders had reason to believe there was meaningful liquidation value if it came to that. The structure of the negotiation tells you the rest. If to simplify, the bondholders had leverage. priority claims, collateral, and the ability to block any deal that subordinated them. The federal side had urgency, but not very much leverage of its own. A rescue couldn't proceed without creditor support, and the creditors didn't have an obvious reason to give it. There were political and funding headwinds on the federal side too, including disagreement inside the administration over whether and how to fund the bailout. The public reporting consistently points to creditor opposition, the priority dispute, and the lack of fresh capital outside of the disputed package as the central reasons the rescue failed. So, here's the bottom line. Ultra low cost carrier is a low cost business model. That part is true. But the way it gets to that low cost is by stripping out buffer, by pushing many variables toward the edge of what they can hold. That's how the unit cost gets thin enough to undercut a legacy carrier in the first place. The problem is that once you strip the buffer out, there's almost nothing left to absorb a shock. So, when fuel spikes or when aircraft availability drops, when legacy carriers compress into your fare band, you don't have much room to adjust. The model can stop working very quickly. And at the moment it does stop working, the people who decide your future aren't your customers and neither your CEO. Those deciding are your creditors, doing recovery math inside the bankruptcy process, in a position where their priority gives them leverage you no longer have, and their personal interests are no longer aligned with yours as a company. Now, before we wrap up, a few things worth saying. Ultra low cost carriers aren't dead. Frontier is still flying even though it's been taking quarterly losses recently. Allegiant, which operates in the same fuel environment Spirit did, actually just posted its best first quarter since before the pandemic, with roughly 15% operating margin. Ryanair in Europe remains profitable at significant scale. The point is that whatever killed Spirit isn't simply the model. It was the model, plus a specific combination of company-level vulnerabilities. Two strategic exits closed, an engine defect concentrated in Spirit's A320neo fleet, a March 2026 plan built on fuel assumptions that broke within weeks, and a balance sheet that had already been thinned out by the previous bankruptcy. Frontier and Allegiant don't carry that exact combination. Ryanair has fuel hedges that Spirit didn't. In fact, by Spirit's own filings, the company had no outstanding jet fuel derivatives as of the end of 2025, and hadn't engaged in any fuel hedging since 2015. Read that one again, because it matters. Spirit went into a fuel shock in 2026 with no fuel hedges in place for 10 years. For those wondering, if to simplify, a fuel hedge is basically insurance against fuel prices exploding. Imagine fuel suddenly doubles in price. So, if you hedged fuel earlier, you already locked in cheaper prices ahead of time. If you didn't hedge, you must pay the new expensive market price immediately. So, if you take one thing from the survivor question, take this. The difference between an ultra-low-cost carrier that survives a shock and an ultra-low-cost carrier that doesn't isn't really the model. It's how much shock absorption capacity is left in the tank when the shock hits. Spirit's tank by April was already running close to empty. The other thing we're saying is that the bondholder dynamic we just walked through is specific to a company that had already been through one bankruptcy and was in the middle of a second. A pre-bankruptcy ultra-low-cost carrier isn't sitting in the same capital stack position. So please don't generalize this specific case to every distressed business. Generalize the principle. And here's what I think the principle is. A business model that only works at one specific operating point isn't really a business model. It's luck. Spirit worked when fuel was cheap, when the planes were flying, when the legacy carrier stayed out of the lower fare bands, and when customers tolerated paying a la carte for things that used to be included. None of those four conditions are permanent. None of them in retrospect were even particularly stable. They just happened to coexist for long enough that everyone, including, eventually, Spirit's own leadership, mistook a lucky streak for a truly working model. Now, two more thoughts to take with you, and then we will close. The first one. If you run a business, stress test the model against any two input shocks landing inside an 18-month window. If your model survives one shock but not the pair of them, then the resilience problem already exists in the business. It's just hiding, waiting for the second shock to arrive to become visible. Now, the second one. The capital you raise today shapes who has leverage when things break later. Senior debt feels cheap on the day you issue it because the coupon is low. But what you're also handing your senior creditors when you give them priority in the capital stack is leverage in the room if and when things eventually go wrong. Spirit didn't lose only to its customers. By the end, the decisive leverage in the company had shifted to its bondholders and creditors. And they held that leverage because years earlier, on a day when nothing seemed to be on fire, the company had given it to them in exchange for cheaper money. The story you've heard this week is indeed about an airline, but there is also another story underneath it that is about what optimization actually costs and about who ends up holding the leverage when the cost finally comes to you. And that's about it. Thank you so much for listening. If you found this episode useful, please give this podcast a 5-star rating and subscribe to this channel. It really means a lot to me. By the way, if you prefer listening on the go, AppliedStuff is also on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Music. Also, you'll find my socials in the description in case you would like to connect or support this channel. Thank you so much. See you in the next one. And until then, think deeper and act smarter. Bye bye. A quick disclaimer. The content presented on this channel is provided strictly for discussion purposes. Nothing presented should be interpreted as legal, financial, economic, or any professional advice. By consuming this content, you acknowledge that you remain fully responsible for your own decisions. I disclaim any liability for outcomes resulting from the use or interpretation of the information presented. The information may contain errors or omissions and is provided without warranty of accuracy or completeness.